The lights of the city rose like a second sun, and standing at the center of that manufactured dawn was a man who had rehearsed his smile so many times that his own face had forgotten what honesty looked like. Homelander lifted his chin the way generals lift banners, and the crowd below responded exactly as the algorithms predicted. They cheered. They wept. They clutched their children and pointed at the sky as if the sky itself belonged to him. Somewhere far above the applause, a VOD producer whispered into a headset that this was the shot of the decade, and every camera on Earth agreed. He had saved another building, stopped another crisis, defeated another villain conveniently scheduled between commercial breaks. To the world, he was salvation with a jawline. To himself, he was already something greater than a man. He did not notice the sky change at first. Nobody did. The clouds thickened in a way that felt wrong, curling inward as if something behind them was breathing. A low hum crawled through the air, deeper than thunder, older than sound itself. Birds fell silent. Screens flickered. Somewhere in the crowd, a child began to cry without knowing why. Homelander felt it before he understood it, a pressure against his skull that pressed inward like fingers testing the softness of fruit. He turned his gaze upward, expecting a missile, an aircraft, a rival, anything he could punch through. Instead, he saw a woe. The sky itself had split open, and behind it there was no darkness, no light, no vacuum. There was watching. There was hunger. There was a color that human language had never been given permission to describe. The rift pulled him upward before he understood he was moving. His cape whipped against a wind that came from nowhere. He tried to laugh, because laughter was the only weapon he had ever needed. The laugh caught in his throat like a bone. Voices reached him through the tear, thousands of them, millions, all speaking at once in every language, and none. They knew his name. They knew the names beneath his name. They knew the boy in the tank. They knew the milk he never drank. They knew every performance and every private cruelty, and they were amused. Then the sky closed behind him and Earth was gone. He fell for what might have been a second or a century. The Imperium does not measure time the way meat prefers. Shapes moved past him that had no business existing, faces without bodies and bodies without geometry. Cathedrals of bone drifting through storms of screaming color. Something enormous turned to look at him, and he understood, in a way he had never understood anything, that he was not important enough to be eaten. The realization struck him harder than any blow he had ever received. Then reality vomited him back into itself, and he crashed downward through a burning sky toward a world he could not have imagined even in his most theatrical nightmares. He struck the ground hard enough to crater it. Stone the color of old iron shattered beneath his shoulders. He rose slowly, coughing dust that tasted of incense and burned oil, and he lifted his eyes to see what kind of stage he had been thrown onto now. What he saw made him forget for a moment how to breathe. The city stretched in every direction until direction itself surrendered. Towers rose so high that their upper floors vanished into cloud, and above the clouds rose more towers still, black spires and iron cathedrals stacked upon each other like the bones of dead gods piled by patient hands. Statues the size of mountains stood along the avenues, their stone faces weeping soot, their swords raised toward a sky that had already been lost. Chimneys the width of stadiums exhaled fire into the horizon. Bells the size of houses tolled somewhere far above, and their sound was not music but sentence. The slow verdict of a machine that had been grinding human lives into fuel for longer than his species had existed. And the people. He had never seen so many people. Rivers of them poured through the streets in every direction, gray uniforms and gray faces, marching toward gates that never closed and factories that never slept. Children carried rifles taller than themselves. Old men pushed carts of ammunition with hands that had forgotten softness. Women in rags prayed to icons of a skeletal figure whose golden eyes seemed to follow every soul in the crowd. Above them all, in the ruined orange of a sky that had never seen a clean morning, air raid sirens howled like grieving animals, and no one flinched. Homelander lifted himself into the air. He hovered above the marching millions, his cape catching a wind that stank of promethium and blood. He smiled the smile that had ended presidencies and started religions. He waited for the reaction he had been trained since birth to expect. He waited for the pointing fingers. The camera droned. The chance of his name rising from a grateful humanity. Nothing came. The columns kept marching. The factories kept breathing smoke. A shell landed 3 streets away and turned a temple into a memory, and the people did not even turn their heads. A commissar somewhere shouted an order in a language he almost understood, and the line of soldiers beneath him stepped over their own dead without breaking stride. A mother pulled her child forward by the wrist as artillery walked its slow, indifferent path across a neighborhood that no longer had a name. No one looked up. No one saw him. No one cared. He drifted lower, close enough that his shadow fell across 100 faces. Those faces did not lift. He shouted. His voice, the voice that had made senators tremble, was swallowed by sirens and the endless coughing of engines. He landed in the middle of a plaza where a public execution was taking place, and the crowd simply parted around him as if he were a lamppost that had grown in the wrong spot. The condemned man was shot. The corpse was dragged away. The next name was called. Life continued, if such a thing could still be called life. Homelander stood very still. For the first time since he had been born in a laboratory and christened a savior, he felt the small cold thing at the base of his spine that ordinary humans call fear. He did not have a word for it yet. He would learn. Above him the sky remained the color of drying blood, and somewhere far beyond it, in currents that no eye could follow, the first amused whisper began to curl toward him. He had entered a universe where suffering was not an event but a climate, and this climate had noticed him. He decided, as men like him always decide, that the problem was presentation. The crowd had not seen him properly. The city was too loud, the sky too cluttered, the people too broken to recognize a savior when one landed among them. He needed a stage. He needed an enemy. He needed the oldest trick in his catalog, the manufactured rescue, the villain conveniently placed for the camera. He rose into the air and let his senses reach outward, listening past the sirens, past the bells, past the choir of grinding machinery. He found what he was looking for on the eastern edge of the hive, where the walls were burning. Cultists. He did not know the word yet, but he recognized the shape of them. Men and women in filthy robes, their skin carved with symbols that seemed to writhe when he blinked, chanting in a language that felt like insects crawling behind his eyes. They were pouring through a breach in the outer wall, hundreds of them, thousands, their weapons crude, their voices ecstatic. Imperial guardsmen died in trenches trying to hold the line, boys in flak armor firing until their rifles glowed, then dying with prayers on their lips. It was, he decided, perfect. A slaughter waiting for a hero. A camera-ready massacre in need of a Homelander. He descended like a comet. His laser vision opened the front rank of cultists in a single sweeping line, cutting bodies in half at the waist, boiling the ground beneath them into glass. He landed at the center of the breach and did what he had been designed to do. He killed. He killed beautifully, artistically, the way an actor delivers a monologue he has rehearsed since childhood. He tore heads from shoulders. He punched through chests. He caught a rocket in one hand and threw it back down the throat of the crowd that had launched it. Within minutes the breach was silent, the cultist advance was a memory, and the corpses were stacked so high they leaned against the wall like a monument he had built to himself. He turned toward the Imperial trenches, arms open, smile ready. He waited for the salute. He waited for the tears of grateful soldiers. He waited for the trembling officer who would kneel and beg him to lead them. The guardsmen raised their rifles. They did not raise them in celebration. They raised them at him. A commissar in a black greatcoat stepped forward, his bolt pistol steady, his eyes the color of frozen iron. The commissar did not shout. He did not tremble. He simply looked at Homelander the way a butcher looks at a carcass whose species he has not yet identified, and he spoke a single word into a vox bead. The word was not for Homelander. The word was about him. The word summoned something worse. From the smoke behind the trench line came men in robes the color of dried blood, their faces hidden behind masks shaped like screaming skulls. They carried staves crowned with the twin-headed eagle, and around them moved servitors with weapons grafted into their arms and prayers stitched into their tongues. The Inquisition had arrived. They did not ask his name. They did not ask his allegiance. They did not care whether he was mutant, Xenos, demon, or something the Imperium did not yet have a file for. They only needed to know one thing about him, and they had already decided the answer. He was unsanctioned. He was unclean. He was to be taken or he was to be burned. The staves lifted. The prayers began. The air itself grew heavy with a hostility older than his entire species. Homelander laughed. The laugh was a reflex, the same laugh he had used on senators and journalists and children whose parents he had just killed. He rose into the air, ready to demonstrate once again why the powerful were always right and the small were always wrong. He opened his mouth to give the speech he had been giving since he was old enough to speak. The ground shook before he finished the first word. They came up the road in perfect formation, and the road itself seemed to lean out of their way. 9 of them. 9 figures in armor the color of deep bone and sanctified steel, each of them taller than any man he had ever seen, each of them wider than a doorway, each of them moving with the terrible unhurried certainty of avalanches that have already decided which village to bury. Their helmets were skulls carved by artisans who worshiped death. Their weapons were relics older than his home planet. On their pauldrons burned insignia that meant nothing to him and everything to every soul around him. And the guardsmen who had been about to shoot him now dropped to their knees in the mud and wept with a joy that looked almost like grief. Space Marines, the Emperor's angels, the Adeptus Astartes. He tried to intimidate them. It was the only script he knew. He hovered above them and let his eyes glow, let his voice deepen, let his cape catch the burning wind. He told them who he was. He told them what he had done to the cultists. He told them what he would do to them if they did not kneel. He waited for the flicker of fear that had appeared in every human face he had ever addressed. The flicker did not come. Fear had been surgically removed from these men before their voices had finished breaking. Their leader, a sergeant whose armor bore the scars of 100 worlds, looked up at him with an expression that was not anger, not awe, not curiosity. It was the expression a man wears when he is deciding which tool to use on a job he has already done 1,000 times. The sergeant raised his bolter. He did not speak. He simply fired. Homelander struck first because Homelander always struck first. He came down like a falling star, faster than the eye could follow, and drove his fist into the sergeant's chest with the force that had once shattered a bank vault in Ohio. The blow landed. The ceramite cracked. The Marine staggered a single step backward, and then he simply kept fighting. He did not fall. He did not scream. He swung a chainsword the length of a car and opened a wound across Homelander's ribs that bled for the first time in years. The battle that followed shocked him more than the wound. These giants did not fight like men. They fought like a machine that had been given faith. They moved in overlapping fields of fire. They covered each other without speaking. When one fell to his heat vision, another stepped into the gap before the body finished dropping. When he tore the arm from a second, the wounded Marine simply switched hands and kept firing. There was no fear in them. There was no ego in them. There was only the work, and the work was him. He killed 2. He broke a 3rd. He rose into the sky panting, blood in his teeth, and looked down expecting the survivors to retreat. They did not retreat. They advanced. And behind them on the far ridge more transports were landing. More giants were disembarking. More faith was arriving, and it did not care how tired he was. For the first time in his life, Homelander had met men who were willing to die without granting him the courtesy of being feared. He fled. He would not have called it that, of course. He would have called it repositioning or strategic withdrawal, or the wise decision of a general choosing his battlefield. But the truth, buried beneath the language he used to lie to himself, was that he ran. He rose above the clouds where the Marines could not immediately follow, and he flew, and he kept flying, because standing still felt like an invitation for something worse to arrive. Beneath him, the hive city rolled on, and when it finally ended, the world did not become quieter. It became worse. He crossed a continent in an hour and saw no place where the war had not already arrived. He saw farmland where the crops were people, endless rows of bound prisoners tied to stakes so that their bodies could feed the soil of some cult's harvest ritual. He saw manufactoria the size of small nations, their smokestacks vomiting a black grease that fell as rain on cities downwind. He saw a river that had turned red not as metaphor but as chemistry, and along its banks stood soldiers washing their bayonets in the current as if the color were normal, as if the color had always been there. He saw a train 10 miles long carrying nothing but coffins, and behind it a second train, empty, moving in the opposite direction to be filled. He landed in a village because the word village still meant something to him, and he expected the smaller scale to be gentler. It was not. The village had been executed. Every man, woman, and child had been arranged in neat rows in the central square. Their throats opened with the same practiced cut, and above them, nailed to the wall of the chapel, was a scroll listing their crimes. He could not read the language, but he understood the shape of a bureaucratic form. Someone had filled out paperwork before ordering this. Someone had stamped it. Someone had filed a copy. The horror of the place was not that it had happened. The horror was that it had been processed. He tried in the next town to be what he had always been. He landed in the square and made his speech. He told them he had come from another world. He told them he was stronger than any threat they faced. He told them he could protect them, feed them, save them, if only they would follow him. He waited for the miracle to work the way it always worked. An old woman looked at him with eyes the color of wet ash. She did not kneel. She did not weep. She asked him in a voice that had forgotten how to hope whether he had brought grain. He said no. She asked whether he had brought ammunition. He said no. She asked whether he was a sanctioned psyker with papers from the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. He did not know what that meant. She turned away from him and continued sweeping the blood of her grandson off the doorstep, because the blood was a chore and he was not. In the next city he tried harder. He saved a convoy from an ambush. He tore an armored vehicle in half with his hands. He hovered above the survivors and told them again that he was their protector, that a new age was beginning, that they should carry his name to their leaders. The convoy commander, a scarred woman with a bionic jaw, looked up at him and simply asked what regiment he belonged to. He said he belonged to no regiment. She asked which forge world had produced him. He said none. She asked to see his identification tags, his baptismal seal, his commissar's authorization, any single piece of paper proving he was permitted to exist within the Imperium of man. He had nothing. She sighed the sigh of a woman who has too much work to argue with a madman, and she noted him in her log as unclassified anomaly, likely mutant, recommend inquisitorial review. Then she got back into her vehicle and drove away, and the war she was driving into was more important than him. He began to understand, slowly, the shape of the thing he had fallen into. This was not a world that could be conquered by being loved. This was not a world that could even be conquered by being feared. This was a world where love and fear were both luxuries, where every soul had already used up its lifetime allotment of both by the age of 12. The citizens of the Imperium did not disbelieve in him. They simply had no shelf on which to place him. He was not on any form. He was not in any prayer. He was not part of any chain of command. And in a galaxy of 1,000,000 worlds and a trillion souls, the thing that did not appear on a form did not, in any meaningful sense, exist. He landed on a rooftop above a burning district and sat down, which was something he had not done without an audience in 20 years. He watched the fires. He watched the shuttles descending through the smoke to evacuate the Prometheum reserves, because the reserves mattered and the district did not. He watched a child no older than 7 walk down the street with a lasgun almost as tall as her face empty, her steps steady, her eyes fixed on some horizon that only soldiers ever learned to look at. She did not glance at him as she passed. She had already in her short life seen worse than a flying man. Something in him began for the first time to hurt. It was not a physical wound. The Marines had given him those already, and his body had begun to close them. This was a different sort of ache, deeper, older, an ache he had spent his whole life outrunning by moving from camera to camera. It was the ache of not being watched. It was the ache of not being needed. It was the ache of a man discovering that the universe had never actually been the audience he had assumed it to be, and that the applause he had heard his whole life had come from a very small room in a very small corner of a very small planet, and that the walls of that room had just fallen away. And far above him, farther than his eyes could see, farther than his mind could reach, in the layer of reality that lay behind reality, something turned its attention toward that ache. 4 things, in fact, though at first they were only one attention divided into moods. In the boiling ocean of the immaterium, where thought is weather and emotion is geography, a ripple had begun to spread. A new soul had arrived in the material universe carrying an unusual concentration of a very particular flavor. And that flavor was pride, so pure it had never been diluted by the smallest drop of humility. The warp tasted him. The warp smiled. The warp did not need to hurry. It had already learned across 10,000 years that souls like his always came home eventually. The whispers began that night, and he mistook them at first for the wind. The whispers arrived first as weather. He would be flying above a ruined city, alone as he had been alone every hour of every day since his arrival, and the wind would shift in a way that felt personal. He would land in an empty cathedral to sleep, because even gods, it seemed, needed to close their eyes on this planet, and the shadows in the corners would lean forward as if listening for his breathing. He would wake, and he would not remember his dreams, and yet his hands would be shaking, and his mouth would taste of copper. And somewhere at the edge of hearing there would be laughter, 4 different laughter braided together, each of them speaking to a different part of him he had spent his whole life pretending he did not have. The first voice found him on a battlefield. He had gone looking for a fight because the ache in his chest had grown loud, and violence had always been his only cure for silence. He found a chaos warband tearing through an Imperial column, and he threw himself into it, and he broke bodies for an hour, and he laughed while he did it. When the last of the cultists lay steaming in the mud, he stood over the ruin he had made and felt, for a heartbeat, better. And in that heartbeat the voice spoke, deep and delighted, a laugh that came from the inside of his own skull rather than through his ears. The voice was pleased with him. The voice told him he had a talent for slaughter that the galaxy had failed to appreciate. The voice told him that skulls were the only currency worth minting and that he had already earned a fortune. The voice called itself by a name that felt, when he heard it, like a hammer striking an anvil in a forge that had been burning since before the stars were lit. Korn. Korn saw him. Korn approved. He shook the voice out of his head, or told himself he had. He flew onward. In a shattered library on the edge of the hive, where the wind moved pages of forbidden books that no one had come back to burn, a second voice found him. This one did not laugh. This one whispered. This one asked questions, and each question was a door, and behind each door was another door, and behind those doors were staircases descending into a geometry his mind was not built to hold. The voice showed him possibilities. It showed him a version of himself who ruled his home planet not as a celebrity, but as a philosopher king. It showed him a version who had never been raised in a tank, who had a father, who had a name that was truly his own. It showed him a version who had already conquered the Imperium, who sat on a throne of gold with the Emperor's own skull beneath his boot, and it whispered that all of these versions were only choices away, only cleverness away, only one small agreement away. The voice called itself the architect. Tasinche was patient. Taish could wait 1,000 years for a single yes. The third voice was harder to notice because the third voice sounded like his own. It came to him while he was looking at his reflection in the black glass of a ruined skyscraper. It told him he was beautiful. It told him that he had always been beautiful, that the crowds back home had been right to worship him, that the problem with this galaxy was simply that it had not yet been taught how to look at him properly. It suggested gently that pleasure was the only honest measurement of a life, and that he had been denied his fair share. It painted, in the black glass, a picture of a court where every being who had ever refused to admire him was chained at his feet, weeping with the ecstasy of finally being permitted to see him. The voice did not name itself. It did not have to. Slaanesh never introduces herself. She simply becomes the desire you thought was already yours. The fourth voice was the kindest, which is how he should have known it was the worst. It came to him in the small hours, when the fires of the city had burned themselves low and the sirens had, for a rare moment, gone quiet. It sat with him. It did not ask anything. It did not offer anything. It simply acknowledged, in a tone that felt almost paternal, that he was tired, that he had always been tired, that underneath the smile and the cape and the choreographed rescues there had been, for as long as he could remember, a small hollow room where a child was still waiting to be held, and no one had ever come, and no one was ever going to come. The voice did not mock this. The voice grieved with him. The voice told him that all the striving, all the performances, all the desperate need to be seen would end one day in the same soft rot that ended everything, and that there was a strange peace in accepting this early. The voice called itself grandfather. Nurgle loved him already, in the way a disease loves the body it is about to inhabit. He should have run. A wiser man, a smaller man, a man who had ever once in his life admitted that he did not know something would have run. But Homelander had never met a voice he did not believe he could outtalk. He had spent his life negotiating with executives, senators, and gods of public relations, and he had won every negotiation because he had understood, at the deepest level, that manipulation was simply flattery in a suit. He decided, standing on a broken spire above a burning continent, that he could manipulate these voices too. He would take what they offered. He would give nothing in return. He would use their gifts to conquer this ridiculous galaxy. And then he would discard them the way he had discarded every ally he had ever had. He did not understand and could not have understood that this thought itself was the first offering. The warp does not require signatures. The warp collects intentions. And the moment a soul decides it is clever enough to cheat the gods have already been paid. The dreams began that night in earnest. He walked through corridors of brass where every wall was a skull, and each skull opened its jaws to praise him. He climbed staircases of shifting geometry where every step rewrote his memory of the step before. He drifted through gardens where flowers made of flesh sang his name in the voices of every woman who had ever been afraid of him. He sat finally in a rotting chair beside a warm fire, and an old man with a face like collapsed fruit patted his hand and told him he had done his best, and that his best had always been enough, and that he could rest now. He woke from that last dream weeping, and he had not known his body still remembered how. By dawn he had convinced himself that the tears had been the wind. He rose into the sky above the burning world, and he told himself he was still in control. And behind reality the four laughter-s braided themselves tighter, and somewhere in the Imperium a great slow wheel began, for his benefit, to turn. He decided, because deciding was the only cure he had ever known for uncertainty, that the problem was not the galaxy but the scale of his opponents. He had been fighting the wrong enemies. Cultists were rabble. Guardsmen were livestock. Even the angels, terrifying as they had been, were only 9 armored men, and he had already killed 9 of many things in his life. What he needed was a spectacle. What he needed was a monster so large that killing it would restore the reflection he had lost. The warp, always attentive now, was pleased to arrange introductions. The first introduction came in the form of laughter. He heard it before he saw it, a great booming chorus rolling over a ridge like weather with teeth. He crested the ridge and looked down into a valley that had been, that morning, a battlefield between 2 Imperial regiments. It was no longer that. Both regiments were dead, and the things that had killed them were still busy killing each other, apparently for fun. Green. Tusked. They wore scrap metal welded into shapes that should not have held together and did anyway, because belief in this galaxy was a structural material. He did not know the word yet. He learned it when the biggest of them saw him hovering, pointed a gun the size of a car at him, and roared with a joy so pure it almost sounded holy. The Ork did not fear him. The Ork thanked him for arriving. A new toy had come to the party. He fought them for 6 hours. He tore arms from shoulders and threw them like clubs. He punched heads flat. He melted a war band to slag with sustained heat vision. And still they laughed. Still they came. Still, when he broke one, the others cheered as if he had done them a favor, and the broken one, dying in the mud, grinned up at him with red teeth and asked, in a language he was beginning to hate, whether he wanted to go again. He left the valley with his knuckles raw for the first time in decades, and behind him, the surviving Orks were already rebuilding their engines out of the corpses of their friends. He had killed 100 of them. It had inconvenienced no one. The second introduction had no laughter at all, which was worse. He flew for 2 days looking for something he could break cleanly, and at the edge of a poisoned continent, he found a sky that was moving. It took him a long moment to understand that the sky was not sky. It was flesh. Millions of winged things blocked the sun in a living ceiling that stretched from horizon to horizon, and beneath them, on the ground, walked an army that was not an army but a digestion. Tyranid. A splinter fleet, the survivors would later call it, if any survivors remained to call it anything. He dove into the swarm because he did not yet know that a swarm was a thing that could not be dove into, and won. He killed. He killed with a fury that surprised even him. He tore Synapse creatures in half. He boiled hive tyrants in their own ichor. He killed for an hour without stopping, and when he finally paused to look at what he had done, he understood, with a cold that reached into his marrow, that the swarm around him had not thinned. The dead had been eaten by the living before their bodies had finished falling. He was not fighting an enemy. He was punching an ocean, and the ocean did not even know he was there. He fled and told himself again that it was strategy. He crossed a dead sea and landed on a continent where the ground was smooth and black and hummed with a low green light. He walked through cities that had been swallowed by dunes, and beneath the dunes he saw metal. He crouched, brushed the sand aside, and looked down into the eye sockets of something that was looking back at him. The tomb opened as if he had rung a bell. From it climbed skeletons of living silver, their gaits patient, their weapons humming with a green that was not a color but a subtraction. He hit the first one hard enough to remove its head. Its body kept walking. He tore a second apart at the waist. The two halves resealed themselves before they touched the ground. He melted a third to a puddle. The puddle stood up. The Necrons did not speak. They did not need to. They had been at war before his species had learned to walk upright, and they would be at war after his species had forgotten how to breathe. He retreated, and this time he did not tell himself it was strategy. This time he simply admitted, in the smallest voice of his own head, that he was afraid. The final humiliation of this chapter came from creatures who should have understood him, because they were, in a sense, what he was becoming. He crossed a warp storm and landed on a world where the sky was the color of infection, and there he found Chaos Space Marines. They looked, to his eyes, like the angels who had bloodied him, only wrong, only rotten, only richer. Their armor was crusted with symbols that hurt to look at. Their weapons wept. Their laughter was the laughter of men who had already sold everything they had and were now spending the interest. He challenged their leader to single combat because he still believed, somewhere in the shrinking core of him, that a duel was a stage and that stages belonged to him. The leader looked at him for a long moment through a helmet shaped like a screaming ram. Then the leader laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was worse than cruel. It was the laugh of a very tired man who has been offered, at the end of a long day, a very small joke. The Chaos Marine gestured to his warband, and his warband stepped aside, and he fought Homelander not because Homelander deserved a duel, but because a duel would pass the time until the real war resumed. The Marine broke 3 of his ribs, complimented his footwork, and walked away. Homelander lay in the mud of that infected world for a long time. His body was already knitting itself, because his body did not know how to do anything else. His mind was less obedient. Every enemy he had faced had taught him the same lesson in a different accent. He was not important. He was not feared. He was not remembered. He was a curiosity in a galaxy that had run out of shelf space for curiosities 1,000 years before his birth. And far away in a chamber of black iron on a world he had never heard of, an inquisitor in a mask of beaten silver read a series of reports on an unclassified anomaly moving erratically across a war zone, sighed the sigh of a bureaucrat with too many files, and stamped a single word across the top of the folder. The word was exterminatus, though at this scale it only meant him. The order went out on the same afternoon that the Chaos Marine had laughed. It did not hurry. It did not need to. In the Imperium, death was never late. Death was simply the last item on a very long list. They did not send a hero to kill him. That was perhaps the deepest wound. They did not send a champion or a duelist or a warrior worthy of songs. They sent paperwork. The order to end him traveled through Vox channels and astropathic choirs, across subsectors and battle groups, and everywhere it went it was filed alongside 100 other orders of the same weight. Rout the greenskin infestation on Delta Cygnus. Suppress the Tithe rebellion on Marex Reach. Investigate the Psyker outbreak in the Vandyre Nebula. Terminate the unclassified anomaly on Hive World Parath. He was a bullet point. He was a Tuesday. The forces that gathered to kill the bullet point would have been enough to end civilizations. That was the horror of it. There was no dedicated crusade for him, no personalized fleet, no named admiral rising to the occasion of ending a legend. There was simply in the way of the Imperium an assembly of what was already nearby. And what was already nearby was more than any world he had ever known could have imagined. They came from the sky first. He saw them descending through the ash clouds like a rain of iron, drop pods and thunderhawks and landing craft the size of cathedrals, each of them disgorging warriors whose armor caught the burning light of the horizon and threw it back sharpened. Space Marines from 3 different chapters, their colors a language he could not read but whose grammar was violence. Behind them came the Sisters of Battle, women in armor the color of dried roses, their flamers already lit, their hymns rising above the whine of engines in a harmony that seemed to make the air itself lean away from them. And behind the sisters came the black-robed retinues of the Inquisition, their servitors humming, their staves crowned with wards that made his eyes water when he looked at them for too long. He watched them assemble from a broken watchtower on the outskirts of the hive. He counted at first because counting was a habit from a life in which numbers had meant something. He stopped counting when the numbers passed 10,000. He stopped watching when the artillery began to arrive, guns the size of tenements being dragged into position by tractors the size of ships, their barrels already glowing with the promise of what they were about to say. And then he heard the sound that finally broke the last part of him that had still been pretending. The deep world shaking footstep of something walking that should not have been walking. He turned toward the horizon and he saw the Titan. It rose from the smoke like a cathedral that had decided to hunt him personally. Its head brushed the low clouds. Its weapons were bigger than any building he had ever destroyed. Every step it took shook loose plaster from the ruins around him, and every step was slow, unhurried, the pace of a mountain that had learned to walk. On its chest burned an icon of the Emperor whose golden face seemed to look at him, and yet not to look at him, seemed to be looking through him at something more important on the other side. Behind the Titan came its lesser brothers, Warhounds and Reavers, each of them capable, alone, of ending everything he had ever loved. They had not come for him personally. They had come because they were already in the sector. They had come because the manifest said so. And when the manifest said so, they walked. He rose into the sky because rising was the only thing his body knew how to do when it did not know what else to do. He tried, one final time, the thing that had always worked. He hovered above the assembled army, and he made his speech. He told them he could be their weapon. He told them the galaxy was full of enemies, and that he could end all of them. He told them he was a gift. He told them he was a god. His voice cracked on the last word, and he hated the crack, and he hoped, foolishly, that the wind had covered it. The response was not a speech. The response was a volley. 10,000 bolters, 500 heavy weapons, 40 artillery batteries, and a single Titan's war horn all sang together. And the sky where he had been became a cylinder of fire so bright that the clouds above it evaporated. He survived because his body still remembered how to survive, but he survived falling. He fell for a mile through a curtain of shells that detonated around him in a rhythm too fast to count. And when he struck the ground, the crater he made was already smaller than the craters around it. He fought. He fought because there was nothing else left to do. He tore into the Astartes lines and killed, and every Marine he killed was replaced before the body cooled. He turned his heat vision on the sisters, and their faith turned the beams aside, or ate them, or drank them. He could not tell which, and it did not matter. He rose to strike at the Titan, and the Titan swatted him from the air with a weapon that did not even acknowledge him, its shell continuing on to end a chaos incursion 3 miles beyond. He was not the target of that shot. He had simply been in its way. He fought for hours, perhaps a day. Time in the Imperium's shadow had become suggestive rather than binding. And slowly, then quickly, the truth began to press itself against the inside of his skull with a weight that his invulnerability could not deflect. He was winning encounters. He was killing enemies. And it was changing nothing. Every trench he cleared filled again. Every squad he broke was replaced by 2 more. Every commander he killed was buried in the same shallow grave as the last, and their replacements did not even bother to learn his name. The Imperium was not an army. The Imperium was a tide, and tides do not lose to swimmers, no matter how strong the swimmer's arms. He stood at last in a field of the dead he had made, panting, bleeding from wounds that were healing more slowly than they had healed the day before, and he looked out at the horizon and saw the reinforcements arriving. Fresh regiments, fresh Marines, a second Titan on the far ridge, its war horn already sounding. And beyond them in the smoke, more shuttles descending, more banners unfurling, more paperwork walking upright and armed. It would never stop. That was the revelation that undid him. Even if he killed everyone in front of him, everyone behind them would come. And behind those, others. And behind those, the endless mills of 100 forge worlds spinning out replacements faster than he could break them. He was a hammer swinging at an ocean, and the ocean had 1,000 years of patience and 1,000,000 years of grief, and it would not tire even when he did. Something in him, something that had never bent before in his entire manufactured life, folded quietly in the middle. He sank to his knees in the mud. He was alone in the field only for a moment, because the next volley was already inbound, but in that moment he felt, for the first time, the thing that ordinary men feel every day of their lives and call by its true name. And in the Imperium, 4 attentions that had been waiting for exactly this flavor turned toward him at once, and the whispers, at last, stopped whispering. They did not need to shout. They had waited too long and too patiently to raise their voices now. They came to him in the crater he had knelt in, and they came as one voice, 4 braided into a single low music that filled the space behind his eyes, the way water fills a drowning lung. They did not lie to him. That was the terrible elegance of it. They told him the truth, or a truth carefully cut to the shape of the wound in him, and truth, in a soul that had lived on flattery, cuts deeper than any lie. They told him he had been abandoned, not by the galaxy, which had never known him, but by the world he came from, which had built him to be loved and then loved something else. They told him the applause he remembered had already begun to fade even before the rift had taken him, that new heroes were being manufactured in the same tanks that had made him, that his replacement was already smiling on the same screens where his face had once lived. They told him the crowds had never loved him. They had loved the product, and the product had a shelf life, and he had reached it. He wept in the crater, in the mud, under the sky that did not know his name. He wept the way children weep, without shame, because there was no camera to shame him. They told him something else then. They told him he did not have to end. They told him there was a place in the story that was still open, a place carved out for him alone. A place where the applause would never fade, because the applause would be woven into the fabric of reality itself. They told him he could be worshipped. They told him he could be feared. They told him he could be the name at the top of the manifest, the reason the Inquisition wrote his file in gold instead of black. All he had to do was open his hand. All he had to do was accept the gift that 4 gentle attentions were, at that moment, offering. He opened his hand. He did not say yes with his mouth. Chaos never requires the mouth. Chaos reads the smaller yes underneath, the yes that lives in the moment a man stops resisting. And that yes had already left him hours before, on the ridge where the Titan had swatted him without noticing. The hand opening was only the paperwork. The warp poured in. It came first as warmth, which he had not felt in what seemed like years. It came as a lifting of pain from bruises he had stopped noticing. It came as a widening of his senses, a sudden ability to hear things his hearing had never reached, to see through walls he had never learned to look past, to feel, along his skin, every soul within 100 miles, as if each of them were a note in a chord being played for his benefit. He laughed, and the laugh was almost his old laugh, and yet not quite, because a second laugh laughed beneath it, and a third beneath that, and a fourth beneath that, and none of them were entirely his. His body began to change. He watched it with an interest that felt, at first, like pride. His skin took on a light that was not sunlight. His eyes deepened into something that was still blue, but was now blue in a way blue had never been. His cape lengthened without his willing it, and along its edges patterns began to move that his mind refused to hold long enough to describe. He rose from the crater. The Imperial lines 1/2 mile away saw him rise, and this time, at last, they flinched. The flinch was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. He flew at them, and the volley they threw at him he simply drank, and the shells that had once staggered him now dissolved against a skin that was becoming, moment by moment, something the material universe had not been designed to injure. He fought a battle that day that would have been, in his old life, the finest highlight reel of his career. He tore apart squads that had once tired him. He plucked a Marine from his transport and crushed him without slowing. He caught a Titan shell in one hand, and the hand did not break, and the shell did. He heard at last the sound he had been starving for. His name spoken by mouths that had learned it too late. He rose above the battlefield laughing, and the laugh was almost pure again. And behind him a shadow spread that had 4 shapes in it, and each shape was smiling. But the gifts had a grammar he did not yet know how to read. Every strength he gained was answered by a small subtraction he did not notice. The admiration he had craved began to arrive in a form he had not asked for. The cultists who had once fled him now knelt, and their kneeling was not respect but ownership. They chanted his name, but the name had been altered. They added syllables to it. They wove it into hymns that were not his. When he tried to correct them, the syllables adjusted themselves, and he found, unsettlingly, that he could no longer remember the exact original shape of his own name, and that the new shape was not unpleasant, only heavier, only fuller, only more borrowed. His power grew, and yet the direction of that power began to feel less like a limb obeying him, and more like a river that had chosen to run through him. He killed a chaos sorcerer who had questioned him, and the moment the sorcerer died, the sorcerer's warband did not scatter but simply turned, in unison, and looked at him with the patience of servants awaiting instruction. He gave the instruction. They obeyed. And that night, alone above a burning world with a horde beneath him, he understood, in a small, clear voice at the very back of his mind, that he had not gained an army. The army had gained him. He tried, once, to refuse a command that came from nowhere and everywhere. He tried to fly in a direction the whispers had not chosen. His body obeyed him for 1 hour and then, without warning, corrected its course. The correction was not violent. It was polite. It felt exactly like his own decision, and only in the smallest, quietest, most honest part of him did he recognize that the decision had been made for him, and that the ability to notice this had already begun to shrink. He had become, at last, what he had always secretly been. A creature whose gestures were the property of an audience. Only now the audience was 4, and the audience was hungry, and the audience did not clap. The audience ate. The crusade arrived the way all imperial crusades arrive, without warning to the galaxy and without hurry to itself. He first noticed it as a change in the light. The sky, which for weeks had worn the sick green of chaos ascendancy, began to gain a golden edge at its far horizon, a warm dawn that was not dawn but the reflection of engines the size of moons. Then the vox channels of his followers began to fill with screaming, and the screaming was not fear but ecstasy, because a proper enemy had come, and chaos, for all its patience, had always loved a proper enemy. The horde he had inherited turned itself toward the golden edge, and he, at the head of it, turned with it, and told himself he had made the choice. They met the crusade on the wide black plain of a world whose name he had never bothered to learn. He rose above his host and looked, and what he saw would have broken him if there had been enough of him left to break. The imperial line stretched from horizon to horizon and beyond, ranks upon ranks upon ranks, and above them flew banners so vast that the wind that lifted them was itself a small war. He saw the golden armor of the Adeptus Custodes gleaming in a formation at the center, and even at that distance he felt the wrongness of looking directly at them. The way their perfection made his own new perfection feel like a cheap imitation of a thing he had once been. He saw living saints hovering above the line, women whose bodies were haloed by a light that made his warp fire look like a candle beside a sun. He saw, and this was the worst, a figure on a distant hill that even his corrupted eyes struggled to resolve, a figure that armies parted around instinctively, whose presence bent the air, whose name, when the wind carried it toward him, was spoken with a reverence that had been rehearsed across 10,000 years and 1,000,000 worlds. Returned. Real. He had believed in his old life that he was the top of the ladder. He had believed in the days after chaos had taken him that he had climbed to a new ladder, taller, darker, but still one whose top he could see. He understood now, watching the golden edge advance, that he had never seen a ladder. He had seen a rung. And above the rung there were rungs upon rungs upon rungs, and the beings on those higher rungs were not versions of him written larger. They were different beings entirely, made of different material, present for different reasons, participating in a story whose first chapter had been written before his species had learned to bury its dead. The battle was not fought between him and them. That was the deepest cut. He had assumed, as he had always assumed, that he would be the fulcrum of the day. He was not the fulcrum. He was not even a named participant. He fought, and he fought well, and he broke bodies and cast down banners, and none of it mattered. The banners were replaced. The bodies were counted and forgotten. When the Primarch on the distant hill finally moved, he did not move toward Homelander. He moved toward a Chaos Lord whom Homelander had never met, a rival, a superior, a being whose name filled his cultists with a fear they had never shown him. The Primarch and the Chaos Lord fought at the horizon, and the sky bent around them, and the story of the day was written in that duel. Homelander, in the middle distance, killed 100 guardsmen and was not written into the day at all. He tried once to challenge a custodian. The custodian was walking past him toward the real fight. Homelander threw himself into the custodian's path with a scream that had once, on another world, stopped a parade. The custodian looked at him for less than a heartbeat. The custodian's spear moved once, an economical arc that would not have interrupted a conversation. Homelander went through a concrete wall and came out on the other side with a rib pushed through his own lung. And by the time he had healed enough to stand, the custodian was already 3 battles away, having forgotten that Homelander had ever existed. The forgetting was worse than the wound. He had spent his whole life being unforgettable, and a golden man had undone him in a single motion without even breaking stride. He fought on because there was nothing else his body knew how to do. The chaos he had drunk kept him standing. His new powers, terrible as they were, kept him lethal. He killed men and women whose names would appear on cenotaphs on 1,000 worlds, and their comrades avenged them within minutes, and no cenotaph would ever bear his own. He watched a living saint die not far from him, a woman whose light had guided the crusade across 3 sectors, and he watched an entire army stop for a moment to weep for her, hymns rising from 10,000 throats in a chord that made the air itself hurt. He killed a guard captain seconds later, and no one wept for the captain, and no one wept for the man he himself had once been, and the war continued past him the way a river continues past a stone. At some point in the afternoon, or what would have been afternoon on a world with an honest sun, he understood that he was no longer trying to win. He was trying to be noticed. He flew higher than he had flown all day. He set his cape alight with warp fire in a shape he hoped would be remembered. He hurled himself at a Titan, at a custodian squad, at anything whose name he had heard the Crusade's chroniclers speak, hoping that in falling to them he would at least earn a footnote. The custodian stepped around him. The Titan swatted him aside without changing its stride. The chroniclers, high above in their reconnaissance skiffs, did not turn their auspexes toward him. He was in the wrong scene. He was not in the movie at all. Somewhere on the distant hill, the Primarch cut down the Chaos Lord, and the sky, which had bent around their duel, straightened again with a sigh that shook the plain. The Crusade cheered a cheer that had 100,000 throats in it, and the cheer was not for him, would never be for him, could not have been for him, because in the story that would be sung around Imperial hearths for 100 generations, he simply did not appear. The scribes recording the battle wrote of the Primarch's return. They wrote of the saint's martyrdom. They wrote of the custodian who slew a bloodthirster in the 4th hour. They wrote in a small, clean hand at the bottom of an appendix that among the various minor warp entities pacified during the engagement, one anomalous psyker corruptive was terminated by frontline elements. That was his name. That was his monument. That was his song. He did not die in a duel. There was no last stand, no defiant speech, no camera to catch the light in his eyes as he fell. He died the way most souls die, in the grim darkness, which is to say he was overwhelmed by paperwork made of bodies. A tide of guardsmen closed around him in the 9th hour of the battle, and their lasguns did not care whether he had once been loved, and their bayonets did not care whether he had once been feared. He tore through the 1st rank, and the 2nd, and the 3rd, and by the 4th his healing was slower than the fire coming at him, and by the 5th he was on his knees, and by the 6th the warp itself, having eaten what was useful, quietly withdrew its patronage, because chaos does not waste hymns on pawns who are about to be off the board. The gifts left him first. His cape fell dull. His skin, which had been shining, dimmed to something merely human, merely tired, merely afraid. His body remembered in its final moments that it had once been a boy in a tank. and the boy in the tank had never been told what to do with an ending. He tried to speak. He tried to say his name aloud, the real one, the small one, the one beneath the brand. He could not remember it. That was the last. An unremarkable sergeant whose own name would not appear in any history planted a chainsword through his chest. And the chainsword did its work quickly, because the sergeant had 4 more engagements to reach before nightfall. Homelander looked up at a sky he had never learned to love, and the sky did not look back. The sky was busy elsewhere. He closed his eyes on a battlefield whose name he had never learned, on a world whose name he had never learned, in a war whose name he had never learned, and the warp took what was left of him without ceremony, the way a tide takes a shell it does not intend to keep. In the archives of the sector, weeks later, a servitor updated a manifest. Under the heading of the day's engagements, a small line was added to a very long list. Terminated during action, unclassified anomaly, designation withheld pending review. The review never came because more urgent files arrived that afternoon, and the anomaly was, in the way of the Imperium, filed and forgotten and eventually written over by the same clerk who filed 1,000 other anomalies that year. He did not become a warning. He did not become a legend. He did not become a saint or a heretic or even a cautionary footnote. He became a byte in a data crypt on a forge world he had never visited, and even that byte was overwritten by the next century's needs. The war continued. The hive on which he had first landed still burned, and the burning was not for him. The space marines who had bloodied him still fought, and their prayers had already forgotten his face. The sisters still sang. The titans still walked. The guardsmen still marched into meat grinders with hymnals in their pockets, and the meat grinders still turned. Chaos still whispered to new fools and new craters, and the new fools still opened their hands, because the warp had 10,000 years of practice at asking, and every generation there was always a soul whose pride was large enough to answer. He had been one of them. He had not been the first. He would not be the last. He would not even be the most memorable of his month. The narrator of a story like this always arrives, at the end, at the same small window, and looks through it at the same small view. Consider what he wanted. Consider what he was given. He wanted to be seen. He was thrown into the only universe in creation where seeing is a luxury the living cannot afford. He wanted to be feared. He was placed among beings whose fear had been surgically removed at birth. He wanted to be worshipped. He was worshipped, briefly, by mouths that were only using him as a tongue. He wanted to matter. He was dropped into the grim darkness of the far future, where mattering is measured in millennia and species, and where a single flying man, no matter how bright he burns, is a spark against a furnace that has been eating stars for longer than his kind has had language. There is a particular kind of tragedy that the 41st millennium specializes in, and it is not the tragedy of a hero who fell. It is the tragedy of a man who was never quite a hero, arriving in a galaxy where even real heroes are eventually forgotten, and discovering that his ceiling was somebody else's floor. He spent his life demanding to be remembered by a world that had been paid to remember him. He ended his life in a war so vast that even its winners will be forgotten before the war is done. That is the joke the grim darkness tells over and over on any soul small enough to lean in and listen. In the end, there is only war. The war does not care who fights it. The war does not remember who won yesterday. The war does not save a shelf for the proud. Hive worlds continue burning. Cathedrals continue tolling. Billions continue dying every single day, and the sky above them continues to be the color of drying blood. And somewhere in the Imperium, 4 attentions turn, already, toward the next soul whose pride is loud enough to hear. Homelander is not in that turning. Homelander is not in anything anymore. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And war, as it has always been, has no memory for men like him.